Yay.
All right. Cool.
Sweet.
Y'all are freaking outstanding. I love you
Do you have any audio off your MacBook or anything you need?
Nope.
Alright, start.
We can start? All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. I actually thought this might be somewhat of an empty room, so this is wonderful to see. I'm Andrea Limbago. I'm a social scientist at Endgame, so I do a lot of research on the more geopolitical and larger overarching trends within cybersecurity. And so one of the ones that I've been seeing and researching and talking about a lot lately has been this integration of offensive weapons with disinformation and the role of automation and augmenting both, and how attackers are leveraging these three together as their overarching playbook. And so it's important to note that for today's attackers, information security is basically synonymous with information control. And so that includes everything from theft to manipulation to destruction to disinformation. And that is achieved through these three areas, which we'll talk about today: the warriors, the trolls, and the bots. Given where we are in this audience, the one that you're most familiar with, we will start with the warriors. And so the warriors, I know that cyber warriors is one of the more unfortunate terms probably within this discipline. But it refers to the experts in computer network operations, either offense or defense. And since we'll be talking about attackers, we focus on the ones involved in offense. And so when applied to adversaries, it's important to know, and this is, I'll just go through this really quickly since this is very well known by everyone in this audience. Everything from more basic approaches, I think like OPM was credential theft, phishing and so forth, these are very common these days, to all the way, the whole spectrum all the way to something like crash override, which is very sophisticated wiper malware aimed at a Ukrainian electric grid. And so, given this range of capabilities that are out there, these are only continuing to grow. I mean, especially wiper malware is something that over the last year, we're really seeing an increase in that, and showing the evolution of the warriors' objectives, moving, including recon and espionage, but then moving beyond into other forms of destructive objectives as well. And so, as long as the warriors continue to act with impunity, we're probably going to see it's an increasing depth and breadth of the kind of tools that are being used. So who are the warriors? And this is the ones that we always think about. We always hear about U.S., Russia, China, Israel. Iran made the news this week with APT-33, North Korea. And so those are the ones we normally think about. But the important thing here is that we're starting to see more and more of a proliferation in other countries and different kind of actors starting to get in the act as well. And so countries that you would not think about normally as being, for sure, not geopolitical powerhouses, but given the asymmetric nature of the cyber domain, we're seeing some of the smaller countries with very limited resources starting to get in the game. Sudan is a good example. They have their group of the electronic jihad, which basically is used to, in theory, to go against ISIS, but it in reality, it's something that's used for enhancing the surveillance amongst the domestic populations, it's targeting different kinds of reporters, and really is going against any kind of opposition to Bashir. And so that's one level where they're using some of the capabilities that we're seeing in some of the major powers disseminating down to some minor and smaller countries. If you think about Mexico over the summer, if anyone's following the spyware report that came on. So the Mexican government has been accused of using spyware to spy on journalists and NGOs and media who are reporting on the students that went missing. So again, that's in a democratic state. So while a lot of this I'll be talking about, especially when you get to the trolls and more authoritarian regimes, these capabilities are also being used by some democratic countries as well against their domestic populations. And then Vietnam is another example. There's been a group linked to the Vietnamese government who also has been accused of leveraging some spyware and some other kinds of offensive weapons against both their population and multinational corporations, both within Vietnam and outside. And so given this rise of the rest that's going on, a lot happens in international relations, then you get the counter hackers or the counter warriors coming up. And so, and you think about in Ukraine, to help fight against the onslaught of attacks going against Ukraine, you've got the Ukraine Cyber Alliance, Ruhate is one of them, fighting back a lot of the activities that are going on in Russia. The Binary Guardians are in Venezuela. So as Venezuela slowly is imploding and going through some very worrisome transitions, the Binary Guardians are out there attacking government sites and trying to display a different perspective within Venezuela. And so going across all those are by no means a stretch of the imagination of all the countries that are out there, from Ethiopia to Ghana and just in Africa alone. Countries are starting to, and governments are starting to leverage a lot of the weapons that are out there. And so it's not just countries that are doing it. You got the various terrorist groups, criminal activities, and this is the whole range that you can see there, and some probably. They're leveraging these. And so then if you think about these different groups, there is a no one size fits all with the warriors. And so given the shadow brokers and Vault 7 dumps as well, nation state capabilities are starting to be more and more accessible to other parts of the globe. So we'll move on to the trolls, which is something probably not as much talked about, at least not necessarily as much within this community as far as in technical talks. But so whereas the warriors are out there to try and compromise the hearts, or compromise the machines, trolls are out there to compromise the hearts and minds. And so when we think about the trolls, they are generally linked to governments, but not always, and that's an important point. Sometimes they're actually loosely affiliated to governments to try and obfuscate the attribution issue as well. If you think about it, Russia's Internet Research Agency has a lot of the trolls associated or under them, but they're funded by a Putin ally, but they're also still linked to Russian intelligence. So they get these different layers that makes it even more complicated. And so the objectives of trolls is really to help shape the narrative, influence opinions, influence perceptions, and achieve certain objectives. And just like the warriors have their range of tactics, so too do the trolls. And so astroturfing is one of them. And that's basically the use of flooding the online forums with positive narratives about the government to then flood out any kind of negative opposition or dissent towards the government. And that is increasingly something used by authoritarian regimes for sure. But it's not just the astroturfing that's out there, so it's not just controlling that kind of dialogue. It's also creating fake personas or fake accounts or impersonating accounts as well. And in those cases, those are either used to help infiltrate networks, but they also can be used as a way to disseminate the various kinds of information and information that's coming from the government or that source. And then finally, disinformation, and that's the one that I think we've all been seeing in the news a lot lately. That's basically the intentional diffusion of false narratives, false information with the intent to deceive and to help shape the narrative in that way. So that for across these three areas, you can see everything from clickbait to the use of state media to the use of these fake social media personas to help influence and spread the narrative. And so those are basically the major tactics being used, the themes that you see across different kind of groups doing this. For the most part, what a lot of them do is try and take aim at the attackers or at their adversaries. Those could be domestic or international. That's an important point to keep in mind. A lot of this is used domestically and then is used by the same entities for more of a global reach. And so it's either to weaken the adversaries, try and find divides within populations. For opposition, you can think about trying to spread disinformation about how corrupt they are, especially in countries where there may not necessarily be a legacy of that. And it even can be used to the point of justification for use of force, which we saw with Crimea. And so the topics really do range depending on the objectives of generally the government, but as far as the objectives of the funders that we see. Now, it's important to note that Russian trolls are not the only ones that are out there. I think that sort of the Russian trolls what kind of comes off the tip of your tongue when you start thinking about the trolls, but they're by no means the only ones that are out there. China has their 50 Cent Party, and so that's a government-affiliated group that has really mastered the art of distraction with use of astroturfing. Common examples people point to is that the train incident that occurred in China 5 or 6 years ago. It started to get some negative press within China. Quickly, the 50 Cent Party came in and some other groups to really change the narrative and show that the government was having a positive response to that kind of event. And so that's very common within China. Turkey, one that you probably wouldn't think about as much for doing something like this, but the AK trolls are affiliated with the Justice and Development Party. And so they initially actually started going down the lane of doing astroturfing, but had some narratives go awry. And so they've kind of stepped back and are using more so state media to help push forth the government's narrative in that area. With Philippines, you got the Keyboard Army, and that's Duterte, along with some of the other authoritarian impulses that have been driving there within the Philippines. He's been very much so following from China's playbook and using astroturfing very much to craft the positive narrative in light of some of the negative opposition that's being pushed against the government, and doing a decent job at controlling the narrative within that area. And then finally, North Korea. And again, actually, that's just like the warrior. These are not by all means exclusive of the only groups out there. These are just indicative of a couple of examples to throw out there. But for North Korea, it's an interesting example. You wouldn't necessarily think that they'd be involved, at least on the troll part. We hear a lot about them in more of the warrior and the attacks. But their group is aimed more so at South Korea, as opposed to domestically, given the, the limited internet access, although it is growing there. But aimed more at South Korea and building more societal divisions within South Korea itself. And so those are just a few of the copycats that are out there. So it isn't just Russia by any stretch of the imagination. But the other thing that's really interesting about the trolls is that they're going from having a focus more on the virtual world to having more of an effect within the physical world as well. And so I'll give you a couple of cases. LinkedIn, I think, has made the news a fair amount over the summer for being a platform where different groups, not just Cobalt Gypsy, which I'll talk about in a second, are leveraging LinkedIn, creating false personas, reaching out, especially to executives, and then trying to get into their networks and get them either to meet in person, for more in-person physical infiltration, or online to get them to download various kinds of malware. And so Cobalt Gypsy is a good case in point. It's a Iranian affiliated group, and so the case of Mia Ash was written about a fair amount. Month or two ago, I think. And basically it was a fake persona created by this group. She would reach out, to people who are working at organizations across the Middle East and North Africa and even into the U.S. And she would target organizations from defense, energy, like oil and gas, finance, and so forth. And so pretty high targeted companies, but reaching out to them more through the social media outlet versus other kinds of infiltration. And in one case that I've seen highlighted is that she connected with someone on LinkedIn, from LinkedIn, made the connection, created a rapport, then went on to WhatsApp, then went on to Facebook, and then went to emails, eventually convinced the target to download a spreadsheet with malware within it. And so you can see it doesn't stay within a platform, it goes across the various social apps, and it can be really, really persuasive. But it's not just fake personas. The interesting thing recently also is fake companies. And so, in the research more, traditionally front companies are nothing new. But the creation of fake entities and fake companies in the virtual world, is a novel take on that. And that's if you think about some of the research on Russia over the last few weeks, pointing out that there was groups associated with Russia that were created a fake company who then leveraged Facebook's event management invitation capability to try and create protests within the U.S. And there have been numerous cases of this popping up recently, and so that's something to keep an eye on. And that was a fake company crafted that then has real-world effects by organizing some protests. And so most of this is starting to, while it starts in the virtual world, it's starting to have some real-world physical impacts, which is a little worrisome. And so, looking at the warriors, looking at the trolls, and neither one of those are terribly new as far as you look at the range of behavior going on. But what is new is the use of automation and machine learning to enable them to get even more tactical objectives and have more of a global reach. And that's what's really changing the game, I think, for their impact and the severity of what they're able to achieve. And so that's what bots reflects, is this notion of machine learning or AI with automation for both the warriors and the trolls, using them in different ways, but at the end of the day to achieve a broad range of objectives. And so the interesting thing here is and I'll walk through some different examples, it enables either the warriors or the trolls to really target find an individual or an organization, a certain machine, or enables the broad global reach. And that's something that is I think that's not necessarily appreciated quite as much as it should, because that's really, you can get as tactical as you want and strategic as you want with some of similar capabilities, which again is something that is relatively new. And then manifests in its range of, that's a whole list. It's not limited to that, but a whole range of objectives that can be achieved through the use of these capabilities. And so when you think about warriors and bots, how they use it, you can look at some of the research on adversarial machine learning, where you have machine learning defenders using machine learning offenses against machine learning defenses. So it's almost like the bot versus the bot, and that's very tactical, targeting very specific areas. But at the same time, you can leverage automation for something global. Anything that NotPetya and WannaCry, great examples from the summer, of just a broad reach that automation is enabling the warriors to have, and will continue to do so. On the side of the trolls, I already talked about that's Mia Ash. Some research on there, targeting individuals, targeting specific companies, and so forth, but also helping shape global narratives. And this is a screenshot from a Citizen Lab report that looked at the Russian propaganda and the different countries the top countries that they've been targeting. But at the end of the day, it's enabling these kind of narratives to have more and more of a global reach, at the same time as very tactical. And so it depends on their objectives. And so I kind of walked through each of those on their own as somewhat silos, and then a little bit of the integration of the two. really the way that attackers are starting to look at it more and more is how leveraging those three across the board for overarching objectives. So I'm going to walk through briefly 3 different use cases that we've seen over the last few years, 2 from the summer, of how attackers are using these 3 to achieve their more strategic objectives and have a strategic impact. The French election is one case in point. You can think about how the Warriors led to that data dump about 36 hours before the French election. That happened through infiltration of the Macron campaign and then dumping some of the emails. The trolls got on board, helped integrate with the emails, fake information, fake images, along with the real, which makes it harder and harder to figure out what's the real information and what's the fake information that comes from that. And so they also not only played a role in the data dump and its impact, but they also played a role leading up to it, where you saw a lot of Twitter accounts and various content that were either linked back to either bots or to fake personas, spreading a lot of pro-Le Pen kind of narratives, and a lot of that has been linked back to Russia. And at the end, the bots were disseminating both. They were able to spread the amount of data that was dumped and spread the narratives as well. But it's not just elections, and that's something I think is really, really important in the U.S. to understand. Well, elections are absolutely under attack for this across the board. It's not just elections, it also can occur in wartime. And so the Crimean invasion is a good example of that. Back in 2014, the invasion within the Ukraine first had DDoS attacks going along with more of the kinetic attacks and forces into Ukraine from the Russian government. So it's one of those, probably not the very first, but and actually it's not the very first, but one of the first major examples we can start looking at hybrid warfare, where the offensive cyber tools are used in a strategic connection with the kinetic tools used by the government. And it wasn't just a DDoS attacks. Those did contribute to more of an information blackout, which is important. And then from that, the trolls that started having, gain more access to the information, and they were propagating that information in the narratives, putting forth pro-Russian information, so that any kind of oppositional notion, there was a blackout from that perspective, and only got the pro-Russian notion. And infobots and various bot networks were used in both. And finally, over the summer, something that I think it made made a big bump, I guess, more so in the foreign policy community, but the Qatari tensions, where there was a hack of a news agency within Qatar, basically then hacked into it, to be the Warriors, and then planting fake reports that the Qatari Emir had said something favorable about Iran and Hamas, which is enough to lead to a lot of instability and disruption within the Middle East, and that's what happened. And so you had that infiltration, you had the fake report, but then you had the bots also spreading all the trolls' information around. I think at one point there was something along the lines of 20% of all anti-Qatar bots were actually linked back to, or anti-Qatar posts were linked back to bots, and they were responsible for a disproportionate amount of the information coming out there. And what's interesting with, I think maybe didn't put up there, there was a battle of the hashtags that went with Qatar. So the government in this case actually did try and push back, leveraging their own bots, pro-Qatar bots, but they, apparently it was something that was more new to them, and so they weren't as organized and weren't able to infiltrate and spread the narrative as well as the anti-Qatar hashtags. And so you started seeing, it's interesting, you started seeing within social media the battle of the hashtags. And it was similar with the French election. Something about 40% of all Macron leaks hashtags that were put out there were traced back to just 5% of the accounts. And so you had accounts that were just posting by the minute, overnight, all the time, just flooding the narrative. So those are examples from more so nation states and governments, of course, but private companies are also getting involved in many of these different tools, both multinational corporations or private companies that are linked to the government, but also those that may not be. And actually, Motherboard had an interesting report just this week alone that talked about they found an organization that was at an arms convention in London. They found a booth with a company pushing forth cyber weapons, and for those cyber weapons, they within the catalog itself, it ranged from weaponizing information, so it had more of the disinformation, those kind of activities, to DDoS services, to spyware, to having to infiltration and exploits for industrial systems. And so I think it's really interesting about that case, and it's something that they'd seen a couple years earlier, is that shows where the market demand is going, is seeing these all within one catalog of capabilities for attackers to achieve their objectives. And so I think that's really important because it really wasn't that long ago that Zuckerberg said, there's no way social media can have any impact on election. That was not even a year ago, really. It wasn't that long ago that people were talking about critical infrastructure and attacks on critical infrastructure. They kind of thought that was more fear-mongering. But we've seen over the last year, a lot of changes and transitioning of objectives, well beyond just recon and espionage into more of the destructive malware. And now we've got Stone Drill and Shamoon 2 and NotPetya and Black Energy and whatever might be the APT-33 might have been using. I mean, it's going on and on and on. And at least it's out there, which means we're just going to start seeing more of an escalation. So while we've seen the Kiev attack in that area, the proliferation of things like wiper malware out there is more likely than not going to be integrated into these larger strategic objectives for these attackers. And so the important thing to note on that is that I think for the attackers, they're already looking through the battle for information security as information control through the socio-technical lens. And I think that's a really important point to note because once you start looking at it through that way, defenses need to then be structured accordingly. And currently they're not really. And I'll leave with a couple of quotes there. For the most part, so in Lithuania, they're the Lithuanian elves to battle the Russian trolls. There's some fun videos that they've actually put together. If you ever want to look that up on YouTube, I'd recommend that. But for the most part, there isn't the playbook to counter this attacker's playbook. And I think it's going to be really important for this community. I think I was listening to the keynote this morning by John Strandon, talking about this community sort of blazing new ground going forward to help the defenses. And I would argue that blazing new ground will include this entire battle over information control. And I think this community will be at the forefront in figuring out how to battle and how to defend against this wide range of capabilities. And I think it's going to be essential going forward. The attackers already see this integration of these three as a playbook, and they're moving forward. And our defenses we're still caught flat-footed every time. So it'll be up to this community, I think, to help figure out some new and novel and creative ways to help defend against the adversary's playbook. So thank you. I think we have a minute for questions.
I've got a question about norms.
Yeah.
So what role do you see norms playing in this, and how optimistic are you about having
God, that's an awesome question. Yeah, that's so it's interesting. So I'm not terribly optimistic right now. This has actually been a really bad year for norms, which sounds weird. I presented on sort of the two different versions of norms at Enigma earlier this year, and I was more optimistic in January than I am now. Because especially if you look at, and there's some initial signs that some recent attacks are linked to China for espionage, and if that turns out to be the case, that completely negates the Sino-American agreement against commercial espionage, and that was supposed to be one of the founding major power agreements to push back against that kind of activity and create those norms. China even they fostered the same agreement with Canada, with Australia, and so people, while no one was weren't optimistic that behavior would completely change, there would no longer be any kind of economic espionage. There was hope that at least some of these norms would be there to help figure out how we can respond to them and get more of a legal basis in structure. So while moving from informal to formal kind of compliance mechanisms, but I don't see that happening. The UNGGE, which is the group of governmental experts who are trying to craft norms in favor of a multi-stakeholder model, which is in favor of basically free and open internet, is as an overarching goal. They basically collapsed this year as far as after about 5 years worth of negotiations, just couldn't come to agreement on very, very basic things like critical infrastructure being off limits, such as not intervening in insert activities. And so really the low-hanging fruit that probably most groups should agree upon, they couldn't even get anything pushed out for that. So we're not at a high point in norms right now in this area, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we give up on it. I mean, it actually makes it more essential than ever because I think this is just going to escalate and keep getting worse as long as geopolitical tensions remain where they are. And that's the key thing with a lot of this. If all of a sudden geopolitical tensions somehow just abate, which I don't see that happening, but if it were, a lot of this would calm down. But we need to push forth those norms out there and get as many groups together as possible. And honestly, this community needs to get involved in those discussions too, because I've seen some of the norms discussions on the policy side are pushing forth perhaps some things that aren't necessarily technically feasible. So it's good to get more engagement in that discussion as well. So not optimistic, but I think that means we need to push forth and try and set some norms. I think it's more important than ever. Anything else? All right, I guess that's time. So
I don't think we're going to make it. When you said that it's up to the people in this industry
I know.
to be able to defend against the nation state.
Well, not just them, but yeah, I think it's a key role. Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, and this would be for a whole different talk, but I think that this community needs to integrate more with policy. Now, I mean, no community alone can do it, right? I mean, but this community, I think, it's gonna be on the front lines, and this is where a lot of innovation's coming from technically. So, but yeah, we could talk about it. That'd be a fun thing to talk about. Thanks, everyone. I should have done that. All right, I'm going to give you this before I forget it.
Hi, I'm doing a scavenger hunt. I'm supposed to get signatures before it can cost.
Okay.
Can I sign you my shirt?
No. I don't think I've ever been asked for that.